Hey, it's Dr. Tracy here, and thank you for joining us. And I am sitting with one of my favorite co hosts and guests with my husband, Greg. We have a great conversation planned for you today. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me back.
We are going to have this really good conversation, but before we start, let's do something we've never done on the show before,
Cool.
which is to do one of our 100 questions to deepen connection.
So why don't you tell people what that is first?
Yeah, absolutely. We created this 100 guide, and there are so many great questions in there. So, oftentimes, what people struggle with is asking questions like, how was your day? What happened at work? Was there something stressful today? And
Or
these,
super closed-ended questions.
or super close ended question, right? Did you have a good day? Do you want help? Those kinds of things.
Right.
So, noticing from so many of my clients, from so many of my community members, the people that I'm working with and coaching, I came up with this list of 100 questions where you can start to deepen your connection.
Yeah.
Because this is one of those foundational pieces of intimacy. It's not just about moving through your day, being on autopilot, talking about, hey, where's the splash pants? Who's making lunch? Who's doing drop off today? But instead, it's this really great, it can be formal or informal
Sure.
way of building connection.
I think what's cool about it too is it's often not the question, it's the story that the question elicits that kind of comes from it. That's our experience anyways, and I think that's some of the feedback we've got. So I think a lot of folks maybe think they should just know what to say to their partner, even if they've been with them for like 30 years.
Yes.
But we go on autopilot, me as a dude, for sure. So these prompts can be really helpful.
I love reminding people that we build these narratives and stories about each other. And so then oftentimes people will say, I already know all there is to know about my partner. Sure, there are things I know about you, but we spend the majority of our time separate in our own thoughts.
Right.
And so this is a way to actually get to know this part of each other.
I think the miss with that is that, yes, you know a lot about your partner, but that almost doesn't allow for them to change. Do you know what's changing for them? You know them statically or in these moments in time over time for sure, but it's not always the straight line.
Yeah. I love that you added that. All right. Are you ready for today's question?
I'll do my best.
Randomly pick.
I don't know what it is, just to be
I know it's going to
transparent.
be great.
Go.
Okay. If you could get rid of one personality trait, what would it be? And what would it free you up to do?
Of my own?
Yes.
It's interesting. I want to like your personality trait.
Yeah. Oh, you wanted to do mine? Do you want to do
Well,
mine?
I wasn't sure if that's what the question was. I guess we haven't done this question before.
Which we have taken this guide on our date nights, and we've had a lot of fun doing it.
So one personality. I think for me it would be, I don't know if trait's the right word, but there's like this hesitancy to share things about myself. Maybe like it's tough to say, maybe a bit of passivity, like an edge case of passivity. I don't know. It stems from
introversion?
Maybe not quite. I think there's like a bit of this feeling of sometimes not feeling not good enough, but like depending on the social situation, like, oh, do I have enough to offer? I don't have a PhD. I don't have all this formal education. I worked in retail for a long time, specialty retail. But you know what I mean? There's some of that just kind of breeds this like, yeah, I don't know if it's the sense of worth. I don't think it's quite that. It's just like this reluctance to take up space maybe and like be assertive and in a polite, like authentic and appropriate way at the right time in the right setting. Like there's all these kind of nuances to it. So I think there's a long-winded way of saying there's like this. Yeah, I just wish I would talk about myself more a little bit, you know, in the right way.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting. So as you're saying this, well, first I want to know, what would it free up for you to do if you could turn the dial down on this trait and turn up some other traits? What would you feel freed up to do?
Well, as I'm taking a break here, I'm thinking that it stems from me caring what people think.
Mm,
So to not give a shit what people think, more
yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Like that's easy to say, it's hard to do.
Yeah.
I think it
Definitely.
ties into with our topic today.
Mhm.
So I think that would be. So what would it free me to do? Everything, anything. Truthfully, that's it.
Hmm.
Like just to have the mental space to like.
Yeah.
I'm not there yet. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I think that's truly what it would do, is just save energy worrying about
Yeah.
external factors.
Yeah. And Greg, I think so many people can relate to that experience of just this external monitoring of what are people thinking about me? How is this going to be perceived? How does this kind of tap into my sense of worthiness and enoughness? And so it really is, if you think of who we are as social creatures, we're outward watching. Our senses are outward observing, taking in information. And so we spend all this time doing it. I love talking to clients about how when you're in a room of people, everybody has a spotlight effect on themselves. Nobody is monitoring you as much as you are monitoring yourself.
100%. No one cares or
No,
notices.
no.
Maybe a little bit, but
And I even relate to that, the sitting with friends or meeting new people and saying the thing and then spending hours or days. And you heard me. I've come home from events and said to you, oh, I said this thing. Like, I don't know. What are they going to think of me? It feels really uncomfortable.
mhm.
And it really is that practice of like, how do we just do the thing and then not keep monitoring ourselves, not keep repeating it over and over again and get through that discomfort, which really is today's topic around conflict avoidance.
Right. So I'll mirror it back to you. How does that show up for you?
The one personality trait that I would want to get rid of is I teeter between perfectionism and control appreciation. And
Control appreciation? What does that mean?
that I really like control.
Right.
I like
That's
to know.
that's like a politically correct way of saying I like control. Like I'm going to add appreciation to make it sound less severe.
I'm softening it because it is sometimes we take these traits about ourselves. And when I think about you're a watcher, you're a peacekeeper, and we need people like you in the world to be this role. And again, I love that dial analogy where it's like, okay, this is a dial that's turned up loud for you and it gets you to do the amazing things that you've done. You're the person that you are today because of that. And then there are these times where you have to turn the dial down a little bit. So they're not bad things about us. We often say that.
Yeah.
Which is why I like saying I'm a control appreciator. Because when we say, oh, I'm controlling, that immediately has this negative connotation to it.
100%. Yeah.
Instead of being able to see that my sense of control, my need for control is this sense of orderliness, getting things done.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a doer. We get this idea and I'm 10 steps done.
Yeah.
And that just is how I thrive in the world. But there are times where it kicks me in the butt.
Like when?
Like with the kids. Last night was a perfect example where everything was off the rails. We are in a kitchen reno right now, and being in renovation is so stressful on you as an individual, you as a couple, as a family. We are living in our living room space. It's small, it's hard. And so last night, just everything being out of my control felt like it was too much. And I boiled over and I yelled and didn't feel good.
Is there something, so that's an isolated incident. You rarely do that, but like, is there something more strategically that, let me say it a different way. It's like, so when you try to control everything, think of your work. It makes it harder to let your team or your staff try things, make mistakes, and flourish, right?
Right.
When you're micromanaging, kind of corporate buzzword, but like.
Yeah, absolutely. The way it kicks me in the butt is that I don't release things.
Right.
Or I can't let go of it to let it just be done and move on. And that creates a lot of stress and tension inside of me versus then being able to step back and say, other people have got this. Other people are just as capable, which I know logically and rationally in the front of my brain. I know that, but it's in those moments. It's really hard to let it go.
Do you think it's a function of your job? Like or an independent practitioner, yes, we have our clinic, you work as a team, but truly you work individual.
Yeah.
Well, you might work one-on-one or one-on-two, but that's it. You're not working in this like dynamic corporate environment where you're
Right.
cross collaborating all the time and all this kind of
Sure,
stuff.
I'm a team of one in some
In
ways,
some ways,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, because I manage my own schedule, I manage who I'm seeing. I have to manage myself.
Sure.
Like as soon as you said the work context of sitting with clients, I immediately thought of over regulating my emotions. And that is like where control can show up. So where some people
Mm.
can feel their emotions all over the place, which is not a bad thing either, I'm spending all day controlling my emotions when a client tells me an incredibly hard topic
Right, because you have to.
because I have to.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I always love these questions because I get to see different parts of you and it makes us think. And I feel I end up feeling closer and more connected with you.
Same.
But it's a great segue.
But hang on, before you go, hopefully, like, what was that, 5-7 minutes? We had no idea what was just going to happen.
Right.
Hopefully people can see. And like we went, in a way, I feel like I didn't even answer your question. Partly, but it elicited kind of a cool conversation. That's the whole point.
And I want to add one more thing to that. We didn't come at each other because, and some people have told me, I tried the questions and we got into a fight.
Yeah, I know.
Sure, of course. And so then you have to practice being really curious and listening. If we're asking each other these questions, this is not a time for me to be like, right, and remember that time when you didn't do the thing?
Right.
And you never do that, and that's who you are, right? We don't want to point fingers at each other.
So is there like a setup to this? Like, is there a script someone could use? Like, they have to be in a certain, air quotes, place before they can do this?
I have it all laid out in the guide.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, you know me.
I've read it.
Yes. Yeah, you have. It's all step by step in the guide
Okay.
so that people can walk through it and connect with their partner around this. And this is really about being curious and stepping out of that need to be right or wrong.
Cool.
Yeah. Which,
It's in the guide.
yeah, something what?
It's in the guide.
It's in the guide. Sorry, I heard something so I misheard you. So, hey, let's move into our conversation today. We are talking about conflict avoidance. And
Talking about
what? Avoiding conflict.
Yes.
And I think this is something that so many people can relate to. It's a conversation I have in my therapy room every single day where people come to me and say, I don't know how to say this thing.
That frequently?
That frequently.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because part of it is the couple's work, but also the other part of it is the individual work. So when I'm sitting with an individual, I don't have that dynamic in front of me to know what's actually happening. But as a couples therapist, I'm using my relational understanding and understanding of dynamics to see what could be happening here, what's getting in the way, which is important for any therapist to be doing and understanding. But there's this piece here where something doesn't feel good for us. We're struggling with something. There's a hot topic that we're approaching. There's a change or transition. Or even this experience where I've done something to hurt you and then you don't bring it up and you don't go into it, or we have a tiff. Do you have any familiarity with conflict avoidance?
On this topic, I might have some things to contribute. It's a lifelong passion of mine. So, yeah, this is a space I find myself in to this day. So, yeah.
So we had this experience that really kind of just grounds us in how human we are. And a lot of people will ask me, well, you're a couples therapist, so you probably never get stuck in this kind of thing. And truthfully, we do because we're humans. And so when I was thinking about this topic, I went back and remembered this event one night. And it's just this really great illustration around why we avoid conflict. And we had gotten into a bump about parenting that day. The kids were around. It wasn't the time to go into it, so we parked it. I think you and I are really good at parking that and acknowledging when to not do these things in front of the kids, when we need to move on. And then bedtime came around And I was waiting for you to bring it up. And you didn't.
Probably not.
Probably not. And, here, I will own my mistake because this was not my greatest moment. Because what I said to you was, are you just not going to bring this up? Which is not a great entry point. And we'll talk later about how we can enter into hard
It's
conversations.
not the soft startup.
That was not the soft startup. I am so human.
Right.
And what you had, do you remember what you said? And I thought it was so interesting because it's like, oh, I see what you're doing here.
I actually don't, but feel free to share. There's no secrets.
So you had said, I made the decision not to bring this up because it's bedtime, we're at the end of the day, and I just didn't think that was going to be good for us. And what you did in that moment is something that I know so many people who desire this, to avoid conflict do. And that is, I put myself in a bubble and I do the self piece. And the self piece is, how do I feel in this moment? What's going on for me? And what do I then decide to do? Which is lovely in terms of our own autonomy. However, when you're in a relationship, we need to do this self and other.
Right.
And bubbling yourself excludes me and my experience.
I think when I do it, I'm just trying to make myself comfortable to get through the next 5, 10, 15 minutes. It's the same thing, but yeah.
Yeah.
End of the night's hard. It's also often a good time because, for families with kids, might be the only time.
Sometimes it's the only time. And so the people on the other end, the receivers, so not the avoiders, but the receivers, so the other partner then experience this sense of, but when? And it's almost this like holding over or this like capture of, well, then we never get to go into this.
Right.
And it is one of the reasons why I tell people all the time, those weekly check-ins, if you are not good at bringing up hard topics, having a weekly check-in is such a great structure to put into your relationship because, of course, you're running the most important team, which is your relationship. But yeah, it's really interesting then, though, because we kind of get stuck in when's the right time? When's the right moment?
Well, as the avoider,
Yeah.
It's very hard. And, I'm a Gen Xer. So a lot of this stuff was not modeled at all. I think for my generation, your parents probably either fought quietly or fought loudly, but repaired nowhere in front of you.
Or didn't even talk to you about the repair. In the sense of, a lot of my clients say, well, they were happy the next day, but I don't know how they got there.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So they may have fought loudly in front of you. They may have simmering resentment, but there wasn't a lot of repair. Even probably folks who are younger than us are I don't think the generation has quite changed yet. So I think maybe our kids will have better tools for that. And listen, our parents were doing the best they could at the time with the knowledge they had. It's not a slight at all. It's just kind of is what it is. So just not socialized to having these types of conversations. So then it gets hard to bring up. Again, you have a bias towards your own comfort. I think men too, generally speaking, don't have these kind of skill set. They're not socialized the same way. Hate to fall on gender tropes, but it is what it is. It's just true. And I don't know what you see in your practice. If it's more men, I'd almost guess that it is.
We can go into the research in terms of even attachment perspectives, where more men tend to be avoidantly attached in a sample.
Sure.
And that we can link to socialization, expectations, and demands on men. But yeah, I mean, the men that I see very much struggle with this. And the thing about avoidance here around conflict, and I think this is what happens for people, is you then have all of these experiences happening inside of you. You're not immune or absent or empty to feeling anger, frustration, irritation, fear, but then you push it all down.
Well, we push it down, me, but we're also I think it's like it's a circular thing. So we don't really have the tools to repair. So we're afraid to say something damaging.
Mm-hmm.
We're also afraid to like because we keep pushing it down, then it's really going to explode and say something mega damaging,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it then becomes, well, you just avoid,
Mm-hmm.
just easier,
Mm-hmm.
safer. It's like it's almost instinctual, like a protective mechanism.
And that's the cycle you need to break.
Yeah, and then of course when you do that, the receiver, if I'm the avoider, you're the receiver, gets even more angry,
Mm-hmm.
escalated, and it's just like this cycle down the drain. Not good.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that is something is happening within the self, and then it impacts the dynamic, which then also impacts the other person. And it, even just to kind of add into that, you talked a little bit about our upbringing, but I also think there's this belief that people hold, the belief around what it means to have conflict.
For sure. Yeah.
And that was something you and I talked about early on in our dating years.
Well, yeah, because I remember I'd be like, we can't have a fight. We can't have like, it needs to be repaired like right away. Like it's got to be just so all the time
Hmm.
for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was kind of this learning point for you, and also for me to realize that you had this belief conflict's not good.
Hmm.
So for me, being who I am, I would openly talk about things, and for you, you would shut down, thinking no conflict, conflict is bad.
Yeah.
And so if we hold that belief, that then leads us to have thoughts and feelings about something, but then that leads us to act in certain ways. And so for a lot of work that I do with people, especially the men, I'm normalizing that conflict is not bad. But instead, we need to understand that when we express hard things, we're actually creating this opportunity to deepen our connection,
Right.
to offer this experience of learning more about your partner. And it's interesting. So, if we even use our experience that night as this like grounding piece for how we're exploring this, I think about what it would have been like for you to come in to even say, hey, this is where I'm at. It's bedtime. I feel tired. I would really rather not go into that hard thing that happened earlier. But I know if I'm experiencing this thing inside my mind, I now need to understand what you're experiencing in your mind.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very proactive measure. And that's kind of my point though. Like, I think a lot of us avoiders, we literally don't have that skill.
Yeah.
That's like,
That's why people are listening to this.
hopefully.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, when like as I'm listening to you say that, I'm like, shit, that makes so much sense. And I think this is the challenge for us. Like we get flooded, like intuitively, I totally know what you're saying, but like in the moment, like I can't execute that.
I love that you've just said that because it reminds me of something I worked through with a client recently, which is this sense of they're like, Dr. Tracy, I know this in my brain.
Right.
I know this. I know I have like but I just, what do I just, how do I live this out?
Sure.
And so I had talked about how the front of your brain is the logical part of your brain. It knows when you are calm and collected. You and I are sitting right here. We're talking from the front of our brains from a very calm and soothed nervous system.
100%.
But then when you get into those hard moments, the back of your brain, this is very simple brain stuff, but the back of your brain is blaring red, emotions are going, danger, danger, danger. And it's really hard to then do something. So then what we do is we can do stuff that's not helpful, avoid, put away. Some people might go play video games, or they might go drinking with friends. They might numb out with TV screens,
Right.
whatever it is. But instead it's about, hey, whew, my body really overwhelmed right now. Okay, naming it. Even just naming it out loud is so helpful. And then being able to say to yourself, the more I practice something, the more my body actually experiences what it's like to do this.
Okay. So is that how they pivot from like,
Could be one way.
yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like that moment of, okay, I'm making this decision, but is this going to be a long-term outcome, or is this the short term? That's something you and I have talked about a lot too, is, yes, in the short term, it makes sense to do this. This is easy. This isn't creating any kind of hard emotions inside of you. We're not going to have a fight. It's easy. But in the long term, what then ends up building up in a relationship? So let's even talk about that. The long-term parts of avoiding conflict in your partnership is losing your intimacy and your sense of closeness. It leads you to get stuck in cycles, right? That classic cycle of I'm, knocking at your door like,
Yeah.
hey, you okay? You good? What's going on? Pay attention to me. And you shut down or you get defensive, and that's the way it goes. And if people haven't yet, I have a quiz for you. We'll put the link in the show notes so you can take that free quiz and find out what cycle you get stuck in. And I think it's a really important thing to understand is that when you avoid, you exacerbate that cycle.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier.
Yeah. But then I think there's this other piece too for you as a person. What do you think happens for, if it's the men or it's the woman, what happens for them when they keep avoiding things?
Well, I think you end up going more internal. It's easier to get stuck in your head. The next time it happens, it's almost like you get more flooded, you freeze more, freeze
Mm.
quicker. It's just like the perpetual, like builds on itself, I think. I think you can waste a lot of mental energy thinking about it, wondering when it's going to come up. How am I going to handle it? What's the outcome going to be? How
And
do I
then
do that hard thing?
what's interesting too, and you and I have talked about this, is then because you've bottled it, and I've talked about this with some of the men recently I've been working with, is then anger comes out.
Yeah, it's a breeding ground for anger and resentment.
Anger and resentment.
For sure.
It's really interesting, Greg, because when I started this work online, I remember so many women coming to me saying how much they resented their partner. And what's also interesting is understanding that their male partners, so that the men are also experiencing resentment.
There's the other side too.
It's just, it ends up being in such a different way. And when we think about resentment as an emotion, it is an emotion that shows up between two people. And we know it's more of a secondary emotion. So it's covering up other deeper, harder emotions like envy, jealousy, fear, anxiety, sadness. And what's interesting, though, is what we often do when we feel resentful is we go outward. And I used to do this with you. If you change, if you were different, why can't you? But it actually requires us to go inward and to ask ourselves, what do I need to be different? And so even then, when we think of this conflict avoidance, if I put this in this pictures, if you are someone who avoids conflict and you're feeling resentful, that is a sign for you to start saying those hard things.
But how do they do that?
Let's talk about it.
So did we miss anything so we talked a lot about the avoider though, but the impact on the kind of receiver, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I'll highlight in that is, because we talked about the cycle already, but I think the biggest piece around that is the impact on the overall relationship, where men will often say we're not having sex.
Yeah.
And if we look deeper in that, it's because there's an emotional connection issue. And so this is not just, hey, share all your feelings and vent them all out. It's actually a way to help build intimacy and desire.
That makes sense.
So if we're avoiding conflict, then we are also avoiding the opportunity to connect.
Understand. And then are there other things that are happening to the receiver on more of an individual level?
Yeah, I think that can really create a lot of anxiety for people.
Yeah, like I don't feel seen, I don't feel loved.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It can trigger the narratives that we hold from earlier experiences, which might sound like I'm not important, I don't really matter. And it's interesting because part of this too leads into trust. We'll talk about trust in a different session together, but it's almost like you not trusting me to come and share the hard thing.
That's interesting.
And without that trust, it breaks our bond. That's what that is.
That makes, again, this is one of those things where it makes a lot of sense intuitively, but in the moment, like we're just prioritizing our own comfort.
Yes.
Right?
It is your own comfort.
Like it's a selfishness almost, but it's like adaptive. I don't know. It
was once needed in the environment for our listeners, the environment that you grew up in, it was needed. And there were lots of things that could have happened for you as a child or with friends or with early partners,
Right.
teachers,
Lots of
coaches.
experiences.
Yes. And so it did become a coping mechanism. It's one of the reasons why I have a really big internal reaction when people shame those who are more avoidant,
Hmm.
in the sense that calling them toxic or calling them manipulators or gaslighters and
All these buzzwords.
all
that
the
just,
buzzwords. And, I like
uh,
completely pull back from all of that.
yeah.
And it's imagine the person in front of you as a 5-year-old boy or girl. Imagine them in front of you. And anytime they said something, they were yelled at, they were ignored, they were told to go to their room. It made sense to learn not to share the hard things because then mom and dad were upset. Your parents rejected you, belittled you, shamed you. All of that is in there. And it's in micro moments often.
Right.
These
I mean,
right.
not everyone had that experience, but
Mhm.
different slivers of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So then for the receiving partner, let's just kind of highlight this piece here, which is really about a sense of distance between you. And when there's distance, that can create anxiety. It can create self-doubt. If someone is more anxiously attached, it's going to be really important to do a lot of the work around the self, which looks like, I'm okay. This is my partner's struggle. They don't come and talk to me, not because I'm not worthy and not enough. They don't share these things with me because they have this really hard internal experience. And so then when couples can do the self work, then you can come together and start talking about, how do we do this? So it would look like me saying to you, I want you to share those hard things. What can I do to help facilitate this kind of conversation?
Hmm.
Or then you coming to me and saying, when I come to you, you end up with this face, or you make it about yourself or whatever, right? But
Yeah.
I'm trying to tell you something. And it is important for us in our relationships to understand that as humans, we reinforce certain behavior. If I want you to put your coffee mug away more, I'm not going to say to you, you didn't put your mug away. Your mug's there. You left your mug in the bathroom. Hey, found a mug in the laundry room. Hey, found a mug in the in the garage. That doesn't reinforce you to put the mug away. That's punishment.
Shamey.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever.
But
Yeah.
from a behavioral perspective, if every time I say to you, oh, thanks for putting your mug away today. Hey, I noticed that you put the mug away. That's positive reinforcement. And so if you come to me sharing really hard things and I say to you, oh, we're doing this again, or I say something like, I'm not your therapist. You have to go and figure this out. That's punishment. You don't feel good. But I'm using the word punishment in the sense of the behavioral term.
Right. Not literally. Yeah.
Yes. But
Good catch. Yeah.
in the sense that you learn, it doesn't feel good when I go to you. Why would I go to you? And when we get comfortable in our relationships, unfortunately, we do start to focus on the negative things inevitably.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So what has helped you to start bringing forward harder conversations?
It's still hard. Let me say that first.
We accept that it's hard. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm trying, I should say in present tense, I'm trying to take a bit of a big picture view of it, that this is not all or nothing, that we'll get through this. This is almost looking at it more as an opportunity to get closer and find out more information. Instead of trying to get stuck in that, like, what's the next 10 minutes going to look like and how can I get through it? Because that's what leads to the avoidance, that prioritization of my comfort. Yeah.
One of the best things people can do for that as well is when you're starting to do this, find an activity to do together. Go for a walk, organize your closet together, do the dishes, go for a drive, something that engages your brain so then you're not focused on what's the next 10 minutes going to look like? Because for many
Right.
people, this idea of sitting face to face like this is really uncomfortable. And so if you then envision yourself shoulder to shoulder,
Mm-hmm.
it might feel a bit more just more at ease.
Yeah.
Or even in the dining room table, sitting side by side. And if you are writing it out, and so again, you're engaging your brain. So, hey, I want to talk to you about family, and you write out family in front of you. And so then
That's interesting. Yeah.
shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah.
And it's the problem is literally in front of you.
Yes, I like that analogy. You've used it a lot. The other piece I'd say is, and I'm guilty of this every single day still, is leaving it to the end of the day instead of like as things happen. It's hard, lots going on in our life, kids, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But instead of having these little touch points, you kind of like it's like micro avoidance. Like, oh, I'm past the big time avoidance. Now I'm just going to do it within the day and leave it to the end of the day.
And it just feels bigger by the end of the day. By
Yeah,
doing that.
your brain's not
Yeah.
in the same spot,
Yeah.
right? Like your energy level is different. You're focusing on
Mhm.
trying to get to bed. You want to read. Like it's kind
Mhm.
of like the little evening Sabbath is your time, and then here I am trying to like drop in with this hard stuff, and then expecting like some kind of good result from it. So
So for people who feel that something you can do is ask your partner, I have something on
yes,
my
yeah,
mind, is now a good time?
yeah,
And that's been something that's really been helpful for us rather than just kind of like coming in, dropping it,
which I still do.
and we're evolving just like everybody
Yeah,
else, dropping it, and then
yeah,
it doesn't feel good. So it's kind of like this permission in some way if you're leaving it to that moment.
right.
But then I think there's this other piece too around saying, hey, I want to share something with you. And if you don't have anything to say just yet, that's okay.
Hmm.
But I don't want us to park it until the end of the day. So I'm going to say this now, and then can we come back to it when we meet on Sunday, when we meet
Sure.
tonight, when
This
we
happened.
meet,
Yeah.
right? But there was something that you and I talked about that I think is so important for people to understand when it comes to expressing this is how much in our life do we spend time emotional bypassing?
Mm.
And so people who don't feel comfortable with these hard thoughts and feelings
Yeah.
then find ways to avoid having to be reflective inside of themselves.
So can I give you my example of
Would
this?
love you to share. Thank you.
So I love, ironically, not ironically, I love to listen to podcasts, variety of topics. So the earbud goes in. I try not to do it around the kids sometime. You know what I mean? Like I like to do it when I'm doing stuff.
Yeah, shower, cooking,
Yeah,
when you're tinkering outside the bike.
sure. But that I think unfortunately is a form of emotional bypassing.
Yeah.
Instead of like having a shower and kind of like taking some time to reflect, just listening to Gypsy Tales or whatever, so it's not lost on me that we're doing a podcast saying don't always listen to podcasts, but they're like it's kind of extremes of everything, right?
Of course.
So for me that's become my medium. For
Mhm.
others it might be
Mhm.
gaming, whatever, watching football,
Yes.
fantasy sports. You've got this supercomputer in your pocket all the time. Like it's
Always with us.
always there. It's so easy to just, I'm not even going to say numb out. That's different. Is this idea of bypassing. When you brought it to me, it was like, holy shit. Yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah. And it just becomes this way of not having to hang out inside of your mind and ask yourself, what's the situation or event that's bothering me right now?
Right.
And then what am I feeling? What am I thinking? What do I need? It doesn't have to be complex. I think sometimes we make this to sound really intense to be able to do it, but it's not necessarily. So it is just this question of what story am I telling myself? And is this something I need to bring to my partner, or can I release this and let it go on my own? And so then again, it's not this bottling up and pushing down. It's this kind of like, what's happening here? And you make such an important piece here though, Greg, because it's not this all or nothing. It's not podcasting is all bad. Scrolling on your phone is all bad. But it's the idea of having a toolbox and asking yourself, what tool do I need to take out right now?
Exactly.
And being flexible with that. So I'm going to have a shower and I'm about to hit play on the podcast, but hang on, something didn't feel good this morning. leave the podcast alone. I'm
Yeah,
going
you
to
can
get
go
into the
back to it.
shower
Yeah.
and then spend some time reflecting on that. One more piece around for the person who avoids conflict. I think it's really important for you to remember that this is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
You do not need to argue to be right. And that is very uncomfortable for a lot of people, because if I see something differently than you, we can sometimes take this as something to mean something about our worth,
Right.
rather than seeing it as, oh, look, you and I are two different people. We experienced the kids melting down differently.
Right.
And now what do we want to do once we understand each of our perspectives? What do we want to do moving forward?
Yeah, because that difference can be a way to deepen your connection. Like how boring would it be if like your even values or experience of everything is super close?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a great recipe either.
Yeah, which reminds me of another topic for us to talk about, which is compatibility, and just the idea of, should we be the same on everything? Let's talk about the receiver. So the partner who is in a relationship with your conflict avoider. And I think something really important for us to hold in mind is that it is not personal. Just really practicing that depersonalization, because you're just, again, we've said it many times, you're just those two separate people. It doesn't mean they don't love you.
Right.
It means they don't have the strategies to come to you just yet. And we all learn skills and tools.
The toolbox analogy.
Yeah.
Like, and maybe it's going back to the, like, as men, we don't have that toolbox to sit and have this calm, rational conversation around some of these hard topics. So if we can view our partners through that lens, might just soften things a little bit.
Yeah. And also just view them as your team, right? You're supposed to be this together. You don't have to be the same. But then there's this other piece you and I touched on already, which is be mindful about how you receive information. So if your conflict avoider is coming to you sharing something, be ready for it. And this is not, I often hear people in reaction to my script. So these are just offerings. You have to put scripts into your own words. It has to feel good for you. But
Right.
a lot of people will say, no, thanks. I don't want to be their therapist. I appreciate that.
For sure.
And there's this element in relationships where we are constantly influencing each other.
Sure.
I am not going to be your therapist or your life coach. And I can model to you
That's
what
right.
it sounds like to speak empathically, to validate you, to make space to understand things, or even to ask the questions to you that I hope you will one day ask me. Like, do you want me to problem solve or just listen right now? Or, thank you for sharing that with me. I need a bit of time to think about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. People, unfortunately, maybe aren't as patient. If I use this script, the result should be X. Might take your partner hearing it 10 times before they even clue in.
Absolutely. All right. Just one last thing. I'm going to add this. And that is how you can enter into this, to invite your partner to come out and talk about these things.
Yeah.
And we want to find those soft startups. We don't want it to be the door handle conversations, or if they have a stressful meeting that day, that's not the time to bring it up. You might say something like, I'm noticing, or this is important to me. Can we talk about it and put a time to do it? And when we do that, holding ourselves to it, because a lot of people will say, well, they didn't follow through with it, but did you follow through with it? And I think that's an important piece for us to just take ownership over, and doesn't mean anything, just means we want to work through this.
What if the partner is feeling like, well, I always have to initiate that? And that, I bet that's the receiver a lot of the time.
Oh, 100%.
And they're like, Dr. Tracy, I'm tired of that.
I know.
So what do they do?
I mean, this is that second conversation. It is more of a confrontational conversation, which is like, hey, this is what you're doing. It's not working for us. It's impacting our relationship. We are in this cycle. We're in this dynamic, and it's not feeling good. And I don't feel close to you. And this is about our intimacy. So what do we need to then do moving forward, and start a conversation that way? But I know a lot of people will say, I've had this conversation once and then we don't go back to it. But it is a bit more conflictual in the sense of, I'm holding you to this.
Accountability.
to actually acknowledge what's happening for us. All right. Takeaways from our conversation today.
Yep. There's a few, hopefully.
Yeah. Avoidance is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Continuing to stay in avoidance is long-term discomfort.
Very much so.
And so getting into those conversations is about being uncomfortable. But what I like to remind people is that once you start practicing this, it's not that it ever stops being uncomfortable. It just becomes more familiar.
Yeah, it does. Not easier, but
We like familiarity too.
yeah, it gets a bit quicker.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from the avoider standpoint is if you're in a relationship with an avoider, just to pause and think about their toolbox a little bit.
Yeah.
Is like what they're doing is trying to protect themselves. They may not have the socialization. There's some things there. So doesn't make it right, but sometimes understanding the why behind it can maybe just take the temperature down a little bit.
100%.
Thinking.
It builds empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
And we need to start from that place, especially
Right.
if we're feeling more stuck in our partnerships.
Right.
Thanks for hanging out with me today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
If you found today's episode helpful, I would love to hear from you. Go ahead, click the stars, click subscribe, leave a review. I read all of the reviews and it helps other people find the podcast. I'm so glad that you joined us today. I have to tell you that remember, this information is for educational purposes only and does not substitute for the care from a licensed mental health care provider. And I can't wait to see you next time. So remember, you are right where you need to be.